Harper Audio presents The Secrets of Sir Richard Kenworthy by Julia Quinn. Performed by Rosalind Landor. Chapter 1. Plainsworth House, London, Spring 1825. To quote that book his sister had read 24 times, it was a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Sir Richard Kenworthy was not in possession of a fortune, but he was single. As for the wife, well, that was complicated. Want wasn't the right word. Who wanted a wife? Men in love, he supposed, but he wasn't in love, had never been in love, and he didn't anticipate falling in such any time soon. Not that he was fundamentally opposed to the idea, he just didn't have time for it. The wife, on the other hand— He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing down at the programme in his hand. "You are cordially welcomed to the 19th Annual Smythe-Smith Musicale, featuring a well-trained quartet of violin, cello, and pianoforte." He had a bad feeling about this. "Thank you again for accompanying me," Winston Bevelstoke said to him. Richard regarded his good friend with a sceptical expression. "I find it unsettling," he remarked, "how often you've thanked me." "I'm known for my impeccable manners," Winston said with a shrug. He'd always been a shrugger. In fact, most of Richard's memories of him involved some sort of shoulder motion. "It doesn't really matter if I forget to take my Latin exam. I'm a second son." Shrug. "The rowboat was already capsized by the time I arrived on the bank." Shrug. "As with all things in life, the best option is to blame my sister." Shrug. Also evil grin. Richard had once been as unserious as Winston. In fact, he would very much like to be that unserious again. But, as mentioned, he hadn't time for that. He had 2 weeks. 3, he supposed. 4 was the absolute limit. "Do you know any of them?" he asked Winston. "Any of who?" Richard held up the programme. "The musicians." Winston cleared his throat, his eyes sliding guiltily away. "I hesitate to call them musicians." Richard looked toward the performance area that had been set up in the Plainsworth ballroom. "Do you know them?" he repeated. "Have you been introduced?" It was all well and good for Winston to make his customary cryptic comments, but Richard was here for a reason. "The Smythe-Smith girls?" Winston shrugged. "Most of them. Let me see. Who's playing this year?" He looked down at his programme. "Lady Sarah Prentice at the pianoforte. That's odd. She's married." "Damn." "It's usually just the single ladies," Winston explained. "They trot them out every year to perform. Once they're married, they get to retire." Richard was aware of this. In fact, it was the primary reason he had agreed to attend. Not that anyone would have found this surprising. When an unmarried gentleman of 27 reappeared in London after a 3-year absence, one did not need to be a matchmaking mamma to know what that meant. He just hadn't expected to be so rushed. Frowning, he let his eyes fall on the pianoforte. It looked well made. Expensive. Definitely nicer than the one he had back at Maycliffe Park. "Who else?" Winston murmured, reading the elegantly printed names in the programme. "Miss Daisy Smythe-Smith on violin. Oh, yes, I've met her. She's dreadful." "Double damn." "What's wrong with her?" Richard asked. "No sense of humour, which wouldn't be such a bad thing. It's not as if everyone else is a barrel of laughs. It's just that she's so obvious about it." "How is one obvious about a lack of humour?" "I have no idea," Winston admitted. "But she is. Very pretty, though. All blonde, bouncy curls and such." He made a blonde, bouncy motion near his ear, which led Richard to wonder how it was possible that Winston's hand movements were so clearly not brunette. "Lady Harriet Plainsworth, also on violin," Winston continued. "I don't believe we have been introduced. She must be Lady Sarah's younger sister. Barely out of the schoolroom, if my memory serves. Can't be much more than 16. Triple damn. Perhaps Richard should just leave now. And on the cello—" Winston slid his finger along the heavy stock of the programme until he found the correct spot. "Miss Iris Smythe-Smith." "What's wrong with her?" Richard asked, because it seemed unlikely that there wouldn't be something. Winston shrugged. "Nothing, that I know of." Which meant that she probably yodeled in her spare time, when she wasn't practising taxidermy, on crocodiles. Richard used to be a lucky fellow, really. "She's very pale," Winston said. Richard looked over at him. "Is that a flaw?" "Of course not, it's just—" Winston paused, his brow coming together in a little furrow of concentration. "Well, to be honest, that's pretty much all I recall of her." Richard nodded slowly, his eyes settling on the cello, resting against its stand. It also looked expensive, although it wasn't as if he knew anything about the manufacture of cellos. "Why such curiosity?" Winston asked. "I know you're keen to marry, but surely you can do better than a Smythe-Smith." 2 weeks ago that might have been true. "Besides, you need someone with a dowry, do you not?" "We all need someone with a dowry," Richard said darkly. "True, true. Winston might be the son of the Earl of Rutland, but he was the second son. He wasn't going to inherit any spectacular fortunes, not with a healthy older brother who had 2 sons of his own. "The Plainsworth chit likely has 10,000, he said, looking back down at the programme with an assessing glance. "But, as I said, she's quite young." Richard grimaced. Even he had limits. "The Florals—" "The Florals," Richard interrupted. "Iris and Daisy," Winston explained. "Their sisters are Rose and Marigold, and I can't remember what else. Tulip, Bluebell, hopefully not Chrysanthemum, poor thing." "My sister's name is Fleur," Richard felt compelled to mention. "And a lovely girl she is," Winston said, even though he had never met her. "You were saying?" Richard prompted. "I was? Oh, yes, I was. The Florals. I'm not sure of their portions, but it can't be much. I think there are 5 daughters in the family." Winston's lips twisted to one side as he considered this. "Maybe more." This didn't necessarily mean that the dowries were small, Richard thought, with more hope than anything else. He knew little of that branch of the Smythe-Smith family. He knew little of any branch, truth be told, except that once a year they all banded together, plucked 4 musicians from their midst, and hosted a concert that most of his friends were reluctant to attend. "Take these," Winston suddenly said, holding out 2 wads of cotton. "You'll thank me later." Richard stared at him, as if he'd gone mad. "For your ears," Winston clarified. "Trust me." "Trust me," Richard echoed. "Coming from your lips, words to send a chill down my spine." "In this," Winston said, stuffing his own ears with cotton, "I do not exaggerate." Richard glanced discreetly about the room. Winston was making no effort to hide his actions. Surely it was considered rude to block one's ears at a concert, but very few people seemed to notice him, and those who did wore expressions of envy, not censure. Richard shrugged and followed suit. "It's a good thing you're here," Winston said, leaning in so that Richard could hear him through the cotton. "I'm not sure I could have borne it without fortification." "Fortification? The pained company of beleaguered bachelors?" Winston quipped. The pained company of beleaguered bachelors. Richard rolled his eyes. "God help you if you attempt to form sentences while intoxicated." "Oh, you'll have that pleasure soon enough," Winston returned, using his index finger to hold his coat pocket open just far enough to reveal a small metal flask. Richard's eyes widened. He was no prig, but even he knew better than to drink openly at a musical performance given by teenaged girls. And then it began. After a minute, Richard found himself adjusting the cotton in his ears. By the end of the first movement, he could feel a vein twitching painfully in his brow. But it was when they reached a long violin solo that the true gravity of his situation sank in. "The flask!" he nearly gasped. To his credit, Winston didn't even smirk. Richard took a long swig of what turned out to be mulled wine, but it did little to dull the pain. "Can we leave during intermission?" he whispered to Winston. "There is no intermission." Richard stared at his programme in horror. He was no musician, but surely the Smythe-Smiths had to know that what they were doing, that this so-called concert, it was an assault against the very dignity of man. According to the programme, the four young ladies on the makeshift stage were playing a piano concerto by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. But to Richard's mind, a piano concerto seemed to imply actual playing of a piano. The lady seated at that fine instrument was striking only half the required notes, if that. He could not see her face, but from the way she was hunched over the keys, she appeared to be a musician of great concentration, albeit not one of great skill. "That's the one with no sense of humour," Winston said, motioning with his head toward one of the violinists. Ah, Miss Daisy. She of the bouncing blonde curls. Of all the performers, she was clearly the one who most considered herself a great musician. Her body dipped and swayed like the most proficient virtuoso as her bow flew across the strings. Her movements were almost mesmerizing, and Richard supposed that a deaf man might have described her as being one with the music. Instead, she was merely one with the din. As for the other violinist, was he the only one who could tell that she could not read music? She was looking anywhere but at her music stand, and she had not flipped a single page since the concert began. She'd spent the entire time chewing on her lip and casting frantic glances at Miss Daisy, trying to emulate her movements. Which left the cellist. Richard felt his eyes settle on her as she drew her bow across the long strings of her instrument. It was extraordinary.